Hey everybody, Ashby here. This is a video going over assignment 1.2 and 2.1. Let's go over assignment 1.2 really quickly. Pretty simple assignment, right? It asked you to use an echo roll call list of student names. It also asked you to use an array or a delimiter where you include all the names and then output it in values. There was a tutorial that went over single quotation versus double quotation and concatenation versus using commas and echo statements. We're going to talk about that a little bit. First, let's look at the most common result, which I recreated. That is using single quotations and commas. One other result that Kelly had was she decided to use double quotes. This works really well, as you can see, and as it was explained in the tutorial. There's more methods for escaping the string when you use double quotations. So student with the index of 0 in the list of students, the string escapes this value and outputs it correctly. Totally a correct way to do this. If you tried doing this in single quotes, it would break. So let's look at one other method that is slightly different. Let's look at Michelle's assignment. In Michelle's array, she included the HTML around each classmate's name and then echoed the array with the index to grab the values all in one line. So this ends up working correctly. The only syntax issue that I see is that there is a space here in these consecutive values on this echo line that shouldn't be there. But it still ends up working in the browser. This isn't typically how we would do that if we were creating strings. It's uncommon to include HTML in the array this way. But because we receive, especially with WordPress, because we end up receiving so much of our data from the database, and because so much of that data is created within WYSIWYGs or fields in the WordPress admin area, oftentimes we receive arrays with strings that include HTML in it. So I'm really glad Michelle decided to do it this way, so I could just talk about that and talk about how this is totally fine. As development PHP practice goes, we wouldn't do this if we got to create the array ourselves. But you know what? It still works. So let's move back over and let's talk about an example of concatenation. Before we move on to my example of concatenation, I just want to let you know, if you want to comment out a huge chunk of PHP and HTML, just open up a PHP tag, include a slash and an asterisk, and then at the end of your code that you want to comment out, include another asterisk and another slash, close out your PHP. Kind of similar to how you would comment out multiple lines anywhere, and CSS, right? CSS is the best example I can think of. So let's uncomment out this example of concatenation, and let's talk about this a little bit. So here I'm going to concatenate and assign the entire string, which grabs the value I want from the array of student by using the index number, and I'm assigning it to a variable that is the student name. So Claire ends up being a string with the HTML paragraph opening tag, and then the array value index, which ends up being her name Claire, and then we close off with the paragraph HTML tag. We do this for each student, and then we just echo the name. So this makes it really clear what the variable is, and that's an example of concatenation. You notice the syntax here is just a little different for concatenation. We do not use a comma. In fact, if we tried using a comma and tried assigning this to a variable, it will break, as explained in the tutorial. As far as PHP common development practices go, we concatenate. You'll see concatenation a lot more than using these commas. Just because a concatenated string and being able to assign a string to a variable is more useful and just is used on a more regular basis than just echoing three values one after another, which is essentially what that ends up doing. We could also use commas here and echo Claire, Michelle, Anthony, etc. Similar to how Michelle did it. That would actually be a little bit cleaner than using that method. So that's a combination of concatenation, assigning as variables, and then using commas in an echo statement. So let's move on. The next example was not included in the tutorial, so don't feel bad and don't think that you missed it at all. This is an example of using the PHP within HTML. So here you'll notice the P tag is blue because it's not included in the string. It is not being echoed. Just like this H1 and this body tag, it will just be outputted in the DOM, and then the PHP runs, in which we echo our student with the index of 0, which is Claire, and then we close off our paragraph tag. This is typically, especially within WordPress templates or PHP templates, how I would do this. Just because it's a little bit easier to read, it's a little bit more HTML driven. You can notice that my text editor puts all HTML in blue. It's easy for me to notice immediately that that is HTML as opposed to the yellow treatment the paragraph tag gets when put within single quotes. You'll notice it's the same color as Michelle and Anthony's name here because it's considered a string in this case. So that's another example of how to do this assignment, but an example not included within the tutorial. So let's move to the for each loop. This is getting into 2.1 territory, right? We were asked to use a for each loop and essentially do the same thing we were asked to do in 1.2, but within a loop. So here I use the for each loop, but I also use the method up here where I include the HTML outside of the PHP. So you see I open up my PHP, close my PHP, run my for each loop, and then start my paragraph tag, echo my student, and then close it, right? So we have our students and we have our student. Basically, the for each loop runs 6 times through students, and for each time that it goes through that, it will echo student. So it treats Claire, Michelle, Anthony, Kelly, Jianing, and Bates as student in this case, and will output our list. So many of you in 2.1 did this correctly. Here we have an example with just including the array within an actual function. Because assignment 2.1 asked you to use a function as well as a for each loop, right? And it asked you to do it once for the assignment, and then there was, I guess, another option to include the array outside of the function and then pass that as a value, or as it's appropriately called, an argument. So all of you did this assignment correctly, and I ran them through the browser and they ended up working. You can see here Michelle used the double quotes and included the name, which is escaped well. Let's go back to my assignment that I did. And let's move into the function example that I am using. So here I just have my function with my argument. And as similarly as I do here, but without breaking up the PHP, I am echoing the student, and then I'm using a comma and echoing the break. And then down here, I'm actually running my function, which is my function students, right? So this is an example of the second way you were asked to do it. Both end up working fine, but if you're gonna want to reuse my function over and over again for different arrays, you're going to want to include the array outside of the function. But if you only want to use it once, then it kind of makes sense to just include the array within the function like we do here, right? So we would just delete our argument, not pass in the value, and then we would just assign our argument, or in this case, students, directly within our function. And that works great too. So yeah, I'll be grading all your assignments. Looks like everyone was able to complete the work without too much of a hitch. So have a great week 3. I'll be looking at your assignments for 2.2 and 3.1 probably next Saturday, but I'll try to get to it earlier if I can. Okay, have a great weekend. Thank you.